So we've been fed a big fat lie. Always cared about health, to be well and to feel well. I've been a nutrition and health nerd for almost 3 years now. I began learning and experimenting with low carb since mid 2018. I've been animal-based carnivore for almost 2 years now. And although I don't have any formal training in nutrition or medicine, I used to teach gymnastics and parkour. So I was adopted the sort of ideology that you could eat less and move more to be healthy. And I didn't really watch my diet beforehand. I ate a bit of everything: cereal, pasta, pizza, bread. And I trusted the guidelines, and the calories in, calories out ideology made sense to me. Not financially endorsed or influenced by any organization or industry. I'm not providing medical advice in this presentation, just presenting my interpretation of the research. So do whatever feels right to you. And I do have a website where I share information and resources and research on more of a low carb carnivore approach to nutrition. Are the slides moving?
Yeah.
Okay. So fat period history. So Homo erectus, our ancestors, were dependent on fat as of 400,000 years ago. So it wasn't just something that they occasionally ate, it was an integral part of their diet. So the meat and fat of mammoths and woolly rhinos consisted a major part of their diet. And as of 4.5 million years ago, our brain size increased threefold over that time due to its nutrient-dense energy source and nutrient-dense nutrient value of the meat and fat. And actually, there are many hunter-gatherer populations today that have adopted the trendy low-carb, high-fat fad diet. The Maasai, the Inuit, the Pampas, the Tokelo Islanders. And some might think that they all must have been fat and had heart attacks on a regular basis. But despite their large consumption of saturated fat and cholesterol, they remain lean, they have very little heart disease, and they have an average longevity. And they're not eating these heart-healthy canola oils and margarines. They're eating ancestral fats that we've been eating for hundreds of thousands of years. Lard and tallow and suet and butter and even coconut, such as the Tokelo Islanders who have a diet that consists mostly of coconut, which is very high in saturated fat as well. And actually these heart-healthy vegetable oils, or seed oils as they should be called, were only manufactured over a little over 100 years ago. And originally cottonseed oil was manufactured and produced as a machine lubricant in the Industrial Revolution. And then at some point, someone thought, hey, maybe we could feed this to people. And so Crisco was founded in 1911. And that's where that comes from. So cardiovascular disease over the 1900s became more and more of a concern over the years. It seemed to have a never-ending, non-ending rise in cases and incidents. And really the catalyst to this concern was the US president in 1955 had a heart attack at 64 years old. He was out of office for 10 days, but he did smoke 4 packs of cigarettes a day, but that's relevant. So his cholesterol was actually below normal at the time of his heart attack at 165, which is considered a good cholesterol reading. So after his heart attack, he religiously adopted a low saturated fat and low cholesterol diet until he eventually died in 1969 of heart disease. So it still caught up to him in the end and still didn't prevent his inevitable heart disease in the end. And his last cholesterol reading in 1961 was actually 259, so much higher than it was prior to his diet change. So there's some inconsistencies and illogical fallacies that don't quite add up in this situation. And many theories were proposed over the years for the growing rates of heart disease. There was more car exhaust, vitamin deficiency, smoking, but the diet heart hypothesis by Ansel Keys in the 1950s became the most popular theory at the time. And essentially it suggests that eating dietary fat and cholesterol was directly responsible for the rise in heart disease cases. And something to note is that Ansel Keys was a physiologist. So he wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a cardiologist, He never saw a patient. He just makes guesses as to how the body works and how diseases form. So this really was just a hypothesis at the time. And it sort of makes sense. If you're eating more fat and cholesterol, it would make sense that it could build up in the arteries. So the National Institute of Health funded the 7-country study that Ansel Keys conducted, showing a clear correlation between fat intake and heart disease. So Japan at the very bottom, very little fat, very low heart disease. And at the very top, there's the US, which has a very high fat dietary intake and relatively high heart disease incidence. So this was used as conclusive proof that fat causes heart disease. But something to note is that association does not necessarily mean causation. In this example, divorce rates in Maine are very closely correlated to consumption of margarine, which you could imply that if you eat more margarine, you're more likely to get divorced, which doesn't make much sense in this situation, in this context. But despite that, Ansel Keys was a firm believer of his hypothesis, was even considered a bully by even his friends. So he's very direct and very confident in his hypothesis. He managed to get himself involved in the American Heart Association nutrition department in the 1960s. And a year later, the American Heart Association announced to the public, with no additional data or science to back it up, that saturated fat and cholesterol should be limited to reduce heart disease. And any conflicting viewpoints at the time by other scientists or by other researchers was dismissed. Often they lost their jobs, they lost their fundings. This was really a nutritional dogma that was not to be questioned. It was really the one and only theory that prevailed. And to this day, the Heart and Stroke Canada recommends eating plant-based foods and a very low saturated fat diet. And in reality, a few years later, after the 7-country study, another analysis was done to show that of 22 countries available to study at the time, there appears to be almost no correlation between fat intake and heart disease, as you can see on the left. And on the right, in fact, if you choose 6 different countries that Ansel Keys picked, and in fact, you can show a negative correlation between fat intake and heart disease. So it was really cherry picking his data to prove his point. And for a theory to make sense, it has to make logical sense. And by looking at the consumption of fat in the last 20th century and heart disease rates, not only do they not correlate, they almost inversely correlate. So fat intake, animal fat intake, was quite high at the beginning of the 1900s and went down gradually over the century. And inversely, heart disease remained relatively rare at the beginning of the century and crept up throughout the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So it's hard to base your hypothesis on something that doesn't make sense statistically. And in fact, you might remember that the president was smoking 4 packs a day when he had his heart attack. And you can see that smoking seems to be a much better correlate of heart disease than saturated fat is, or animal fats. And ever since the diet heart hypothesis was proposed, many studies tried to prove it. And despite being the most researched topic in nutrition science, it has never been proven to be true. There's not a single study that shows for certain that dietary fat causes heart disease. In fact, there are many studies that show no association or an inverse association between saturated fat intake and heart disease. And I don't have time to go through all of them in detail, so I'll go quickly over the summaries of the most important ones. Low-fat diets do not reduce heart disease or mortality. Replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils do not convincingly reduce cardiovascular events or mortality. There is no association between saturated fat intake and heart disease, or a lack of association. There is no beneficial effect of reducing saturated fat on cardiovascular disease or total mortality. This does not support the further limiting of saturated fat. There is no clear effect of dietary fat changes on total mortality or heart disease. Replacing saturated fat by vegetable oils show no significant benefit in the prevention of heart disease. Replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils is unlikely to reduce heart disease. dietary cholesterol increases serum cholesterol, but was not associated with any coronary artery disease. And as of 2015, the dietary guidelines in the US state that cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern for overconsumption based on the recent findings that they have found. And I'll go over a few studies in a bit more detail. This one is the Women Health Initiative trial. It's, I believe, to be one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive dietary study conducted, $700 million. And it was to test the hypothesis that a diet low in fat and high in vegetables and fruits and grains would reduce heart disease. All things that are considered to be super good for your heart health and super good for your overall health. And this was a randomized control trial. So one of the most effective and accurate scientific studies you can conduct of almost 50,000 women over 8 years. And at the end of the 8 years, they showed that reducing total fat intake did not significantly reduce the risk of any heart disease. So in other words, eating a low-fat diet with lots of fruits and vegetables does nothing to prevent heart disease. You're just as likely to get heart disease as someone who eats whatever they want. This one is another very well-conducted study, the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. It was almost 10,000 men and women, all confined to state mental hospitals or nursing homes. So these people were stuck in a building, and everything they were fed was tightly controlled, and people knew exactly what these people were eating because they couldn't snack out and go to a restaurant or something. So they split them into two groups. Both had 39% fat as energy. One group had 18% saturated fat, the other had 9% saturated fat. So twice the amount, or half the amount from one to another. And although the group with the low saturated fat did reduce their blood cholesterol, there was no evidence of benefit in the group for heart disease. So in other words, between both groups, the high saturated fat and the low saturated fat, they both had equal rates of heart disease, which goes against the current hypothesis and the diet heart hypothesis. And in fact, the group consuming the low saturated fat diet had a 22% higher risk of death for every 30 milligrams per deciliter decrease in cholesterol. In other words, the lower your blood cholesterol was, the more likely you were to die of any cause. This is often a study that vegans and low-fat advocates will often claim to be the conclusive proof that saturated fat causes heart disease. So it's a Cochrane systematic review, so very well reputable study, including 15 randomized control trials. One of the conclusions was that reducing saturated fat reduced your risk of getting a heart attack by 21%. And it may seem like a lot, but just put in a broader context. If your risk of heart disease or getting a heart attack is now 5%, if you cut back on saturated fat, your risk is now about 4%. So it doesn't make, in the big picture, it's not a huge reduction. And actually the number needed to treat for a beneficial outcome was 56. So that means that if you took 56 people and they all cut back on saturated fat in their diet, there would be one person maybe that would not have a heart attack. So you have almost less than a 2% success rate by cutting back on saturated fat for the prevention of getting a heart attack. And in the same study, they show that cutting back on saturated fat didn't reduce your risk of dying. It didn't reduce your risk of dying from heart disease. So even though you were less likely to get a heart attack, you were still just as likely to die from heart disease, or you were just as likely to get a non-fatal heart attack. So again, showing that heart disease or saturated fat has very little impact on heart disease or deaths or whatnot. And a possible explanation for the heart disease, lowering the heart disease, is that saturated fat makes LDL high, but sugar makes LDL bad. So if you have high LDL cholesterol, it may not matter so much if you're not consuming much sugar. But this is a whole other topic, a whole other presentation, if you will, maybe at some other time that I'll talk about the effects of LDL and better markers for heart disease. So cholesterol is actually vital to health, and it serves many important functions in the body. It forms every cell membrane in your body is made of cholesterol. It aids in cell reparation. It helps fight off viral and bacterial infection. It lowers inflammation, carries fat-soluble nutrients around the body. It insulates the nerve cells. It's necessary for hormone synthesis, and it may even be protective for heart disease. And actually 25% of the cholesterol in your body is found in the brain. And it's actually so important to the body that the body can make its own cholesterol. Approximately 80% in an average person of your daily requirements of cholesterol is manufactured in the body, and the other 20% coming from diet. And the cholesterol in human milk, in breast milk, supplies infant with almost 6 times as much cholesterol as most adults consume from their food. So it begs the question, why would the body make so much of something that's so bad for it? And why would we be feeding babies some cholesterol in such huge amounts if it was truly harming them? Here are some studies showing the benefits of saturated fat as compared to vegetable oils. So this one also a very well-conducted randomized control trial. So they took 2 groups. One replaced saturated fat with vegetable oil, so safflower oil. And actually the intervention group, so those who lowered their saturated fat, had more death overall, they had more cardiovascular disease, and they had more coronary heart disease. So again, going against, not only going against the current hypothesis, but showing a negative effect from cutting back on saturated fat. Another similar study showing corn oil group. So they had 1 control group, 1 olive oil group, and 1 corn oil group. And at the end of 2 years, the patients remaining alive was 75% in the control, 57% in the olive oil, and 52% in the corn oil. So almost half of people in the group died after 2 years after consuming corn oil, whereas 3/4 of them stayed alive in the control group. This one looking at LDL cholesterol, so cholesterol in your blood. Those with so over 5 years, those with the lowest LDL cholesterol had almost double the risk of dying, had double the risk of dying from heart disease, and double the risk of dying from cancer. And these are associational. You can't conclusively prove that LDL cholesterol was responsible for this, but it is very interesting to note that those with the lowest cholesterol LDL cholesterol below 70 is considered to be excellent. And despite that, there's all these negative factors that come into play. Even for longevity, average age of 89 years old, those with the highest cholesterol tended to live the longest due to fewer rates of cancer and infection. For cognitive score also, average age of 70 years old, those with the highest cholesterol and HDL and lowest triglycerides had the highest cognitive scores. And similarly, those who were taking statins, a drug used to lower your serum cholesterol, they had lower cognitive ability, processing speed, and verbal scores. And even for mental health, those with the lowest cholesterols tended to be more suicidal. Those with the lowest cholesterol tended to be more violent criminals. So these are all considerations that should be taken into account before advising to the nation to lower your dietary cholesterol and serum cholesterol. So to conclude, dietary fat, including saturated fat and cholesterol, has been eaten for millions of years. And just as an analogy, if we were to condense all of human history over a calendar year, humans really only started to eat vegetable oils at 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve. So it's a very, very recent intervention and dietary pattern that we've been implementing as compared to eating saturated fat and cholesterol. And there was this nutritional dogma in the 50s and 60s and all throughout the late 20th century and even to this day that prevents people from challenging the diet heart hypothesis. despite it being based on weak, inconclusive evidence, and despite there being absolutely no studies that prove it to be true. And there are actually many large, well-conducted studies that demonstrate no association, or even an inverse association between saturated fat intake and heart disease and cancer mortality and overall mortality and cognitive score. So all things to consider. And cholesterol is essential to good health, and low levels can be detrimental to your physical and mental health. So really just eat ancestral animal fats full of saturated fat and cholesterol to your heart's content, and you'll probably be fine and might even live longer. You might reduce your risk of heart disease despite all the claims against it. And that is all I have for you today.